You probably can't even imagine this story. On January 15th of 1998, there was a 5-year-old, Terrell Peterson. He arrived at an Atlanta emergency room in cardiac arrest. Things happen to kids, but doctors noticed specifically and were struck by his condition. He only weighed 29 pounds. Remember, 5 years old, 29 pounds, significantly less than he should have weighed. And his tiny little body was a roadmap of abuse. He was covered in cuts, bruises, cigarette burns, and tragically, he was pronounced dead shortly thereafter. The treating physician said this was the worst case of child abuse symptoms that he had ever seen, and he immediately contacted the police. A dead 5-year-old with signs of abuse, according to the treating doctor, and the subsequent homicide investigation that uncovered a horrifying reality. Terrell had been living in a home with his own relatives, his great aunt, Terrell Peterson, her boyfriend, Calvin Pittman, and also Terrell's own grandmother, Farina Peterson, among others. And the apartment revealed a chilling environment of systemic torture of Terrell Peterson. The sin, wrath. Wrath is characterized by a strong feeling of hatred or resentment where anger is not managed or balanced by reason. The core of wrath is a strong desire to seek revenge or inflict harm on others. This is the why behind the crime, the motive. I'm Ashely Willcott. As a TV anchor, a former judge, and a trial lawyer, I would say almost every single case that I've ever seen and presided over intersect with one of the deadly sins: pride, greed, envy, lust, wrath, gluttony, and sloth, the opposite of 7 heavenly virtues, temptations that, taken too far, turn deadly. This week, we break down the torture, abuse, and death of a 5-year-old child who was failed by those he should have been able to trust the most. A little later, I am joined by Rachel Kaufman, a civil and criminal defense attorney, in our breakdown segment, where we go deep on the how and the why this could possibly happen to any 5-year-old child. Let's get into it. This is The Deadly 7. An innocent 5-year-old living with his own family, including his great aunt, his grandmother, and his siblings, those who by all accounts should love him, protect him the most. But the evidence presented by the state during the trial of the abusers painted a grotesque picture. Start with this first: physical restraints and beatings. Terrell's body told the story. There was a recurring pattern of abrasions, literally from head to toe, more marks and bruises than the doctor had ever seen in any case of child abuse. He had been beaten by all kinds of objects: a telephone cord, a belt, and even a dog collar, all over an extended period of time. The doctor said possibly as long as 1 year of this abuse. There were ligature marks on his wrists, and his DNA was found on pantyhose that were used to bind him to a banister in the home, where he was tied for most of every day. The other children in the home, they testified in the case against the great aunt and the grandmother, and they testified that Terrell was tied up a lot. In fact, these other children who were related to him, who were the own siblings of Terrell, they were made to participate in his abuse by the adults. Next piece of evidence: starvation and forced consumption. This 5-year-old, Terrell Peterson, was severely malnourished and lacked any body fat. He was restricted to a diet primarily of grits, rice, or oatmeal. But it wasn't just starvation at the hands of his own family. Witnesses testified that he was aggressively force-fed with a large spoon that caused lacerations and scarring to his mouth. Disturbingly, they also testified he was repeatedly forced to eat human waste from the toilet. Can you even imagine? As if those things aren't bad enough, there's more. What didn't they do to Terrell Peterson? Severe burns. Remember, a 5-year-old living with multiple adults and other children who are his siblings. And perhaps one of the most agonizing details of this case are burns that were on his feet. But it wasn't just the burns on his feet, it was the severity of those burns. He required skin grafts on his feet. And the reason they say that he was burned, well, it was retribution, because he told authorities about previous assaults that had happened to him. Authorities who failed this child miserably. The state at the trial against the relatives accused of the abuse also obviously presented testimony from the medical examiner, and this was the medical documentation provided. The medical examiner determined that little Terrell's death at 29 pounds was a homicide from chronic and acute abuse, citing recent and remote blunt impact injuries to his head, his trunk, and his extremities. The testimony was that his body was a testament to long-term torture. Add to this one last piece of evidence, as if the rest isn't disturbing enough. There were written instructions on how to abuse Terrell Peterson found inside the house where he lived. Police found those written instructions allegedly authored by the relatives of Terrell Peterson, detailing Terrell's restricted diet and the constant tying of his hands. The note stated he was, quote unquote, always bad. The siblings were made to follow these instructions. And in fact, he spent a lot of his time tied up with a dog collar on the front porch of their home and fed in a dog bowl. You know, it begs the question, what would you do if you saw even one of these things? If you drove by a house and saw a kid in a dog collar eating out of a dog bowl, you would probably call the authorities. If you saw burns on the bottom of the feet of a child, you would call the police. And in fact, that happened. The shocking nature of Terrell's abuse extended beyond immediate family because it highlighted significant failures within Georgia's Division of Family and Children's Services. Despite multiple reports, and there was documentation presented at trial, direct observation of his injuries by various individuals who worked for the division. Let me say that again. They saw the injuries to Terrell Peterson, including there was a doctor who had previously diagnosed Terrell with battered child syndrome more than 1 year before his death. So here he is diagnosed with battered child syndrome at the hands of his relatives. He's not removed from the home. The state completely failed this child. His family completely failed this child. He was returned. He was removed from the home, and then he was returned to that abusive environment. And get this, then that case file, written by the division people who had seen him and all his injuries, later it was found there were fraudulent memos to cover up the system's neglect. I mean, it goes from horrible to worse. There's no good about this story. The convictions that followed did bring some measure of justice for Terrell. His great aunt, Terry Lynn Peterson, was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in prison in December of 2002. His grandmother, Farina Peterson, she pleaded guilty to 8 counts of murder and cruelty to children, receiving a life sentence without parole. So the abusers in prison for life. Can you even imagine? Poor little 29-pound Terrell Peterson ended up on the cover of Time magazine because of the extent of the abuse he endured. Now joining me is my friend and really a no holds barred criminal defense attorney and civil attorney Rachel Kaufman, mother, avid animal lover. And Rachel, I've been wanting to talk to you about this case, Terrell Peterson. And, my opinion is it's wrath. I can't imagine how or why anybody, number one, would kill a child, but number two, systemic torture over at least a year, if not longer, including burns, including marks, including bruises, including belts, including eating out of a dog bowl with a dog collar on, including starvation, including written instructions, including making the other kids participate in the abuse. And it's all deliberate, all systemic, forcing him to even eat human waste out of the toilet. The wrath that it would require for anyone to even think of these things, much less do them.
Um, I can I can understand in many situations why somebody would want to, potentially hurt somebody who's hurt them. To hurt a child, or like we were talking about animals, but to hurt a child that can't have done anything to you that would ever justify what you're doing to them. Um, yeah, I mean, again, it's beyond senseless. It's evil. I mean, it's about as fundamentally evil as you could be, and you just wonder what was done to him as a child, not as a justification, but how those ideas of having a child wear a dog collar or do these things, where do you come up with those ideas?
Where do you come up with those ideas? And part of what they said, the state during the prosecution of the grandmother and the great aunt, were that part of their anger was because they did not believe that he was actually their blood relative. So instead of believing that her brother fathered this child, they thought that it was somebody else. So not even a blood relative, not really her blood nephew. So who cares? We can be cruel to him because he's not a blood relative. And as a criminal, and you always speak your mind, and you're one of the most zealous criminal defense attorneys, and I mean that as a compliment that I know. And so when you're thinking about individuals who do these things. They've been convicted, so they found guilty of doing these things. How do you represent them? How do you defend someone who does such horrific things to a kid?
I think that's a really good question, and I think there's different types of defense attorneys. There's defense attorneys like public defenders, who I'm so grateful for because they don't even choose what cases they take. They
Mm.
they may have to represent somebody like this and figure out how they're going to zealously advocate for them. And then there's attorneys who really believe, and I think I fall into this category somewhat, just that like everybody deserves a defense. The case can't move forward. You can't get justice for the family, for the victim, for the system, unless somebody is checking these facts and fighting the facts to see if there's actually reasonable doubt. Somebody has to do it. Um, I work for myself. I decide what cases I take. I'm very grateful that I'm able to do that. This is not a case that I could possibly defend. I would not be a good fit for this individual. However, I do have like a natural curiosity. Like, I have access to him. So would I turn down a meeting with him at the jail or the prison to meet him to see what? Because I want to look him in the eyes because I'm scared of the bad guy too. Since I was a child, I'm scared of the boogeyman and who's going to come and this is that guy. So you have to look him in the face to be just try to find some semblance of like what happened, like how warped this was, how warped your mindset was. So I would probably meet with him. I couldn't represent him, but how do we do it in situations where we don't agree with what our clients do? I mean, the bottom line is that I need to make sure that they're the person that actually did it by looking at the evidence and then trying to see if there's mitigation. And sometimes there is. Again, if he grew up having these kind of things done to him, he's still going to get a very similar sentence, but at least maybe he could go into prison for the rest of his life with a little bit of remorse and more self-awareness, which, I mean, to do what he did, you would not have.
You know what's weird? And I have to interrupt because it's surprising to me. And I know that you keep saying him, but this was done by two women. This was done by a reminder, right? And I know you know that. We've talked about this case, but so it was done by a grandmother and a great aunt. So that's even wilder to me because I think a lot of people assume sometimes this type of abuse is at the hands of a man. Whether that's fair or not, I'm not saying anything about that. I'm just saying a lot of people hear these stories and think, oh, it was done by a father, it was done by a male. It was done by two women. And statistically, right, that's a little bit unusual. So does it make you pause when you hear it was actually done by two women related to this or allegedly related to this child?
So, I'm going to get in trouble for saying these things. And I'm sorry I messed that up. For some reason, when you get into this job and you see over and over again the same thing. And so, yeah, I forgot that it was actually two women. Am I surprised? Not at all. I tend to find my not my necessarily female clients, but female criminal defendants that are charged with these kind of offenses tend to have the cruelty, like the bullying, is more of a female behavior in my estimation. Like they kind of ganged up on this child of not being their blood relative, and like a man would just maybe kill the kid. But the systemic torture, the day in, day out, it's like Mean Girl stuff, but towards a child. So no, it doesn't surprise me, but again, you're like, where did you come from? Who raised you? How did you turn into somebody who doesn't matter? It doesn't matter. I mean, the kid didn't decide how they ended up on Earth. They didn't decide whose parents had sex to make them. So they're just here. And yeah, I mean, something is very, very, very wrong with
And
those.
you are right. Caretakers are the people that most frequently are the abusers of children. And caretakers are often the mother. And so as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking you're right. There are a lot of cases I could think of where the abuse has occurred at the hands of a mother, and it has been systemic, and it has been mean, and it has been deliberate torture or abuse versus, to your point, I mean, I hate to say it like this, but I know cases where men have thrown a baby against a wall because they're done. And to your point, right? It's very different, and that's fascinating. I hadn't really thought about that.
I had a guy who was at a house who, a baby died. It was a lady babysitting somebody else's kid, and she killed the kid that she was supposed to be babysitting in front of her own child. And then the man that was in the house didn't know what was going on. He was charged too, for kind of being there and letting the ball drop.
Right, and not doing anything about it. You can be charged for that.
You can, and so that's what my client in the baby bath case, she was charged because she tried to put stuff on the wound and this is so disgusting. I mean, it's disgusting that she tried to help the burns, but he needed to go to the ER, and.
Tell us that story again, because that was a case in which you said there was a caretaker, and tell us again how she was related to the child and what she did.
Okay, so in the first case that I'm really thinking about, there was a 15-year-old girl whose parents had left her to go, I don't know, go on vacation or go do whatever they were doing, kind of for some indefinite amount of time, that she was left with her 4-year-old brother at the house of another family. And so it was basically understood that it was her as a 15-year-old's job to take care of her 4-year-old brother, which I'm sure at 15, she might do it for an hour, but she's kind of put in this parental role that she has no business being in. No, she should not be doing that. And her 4-year-old brother woke up from a nap and had wet the bed, which I guess meant that the 15-year-old would have to clean the sheets or something. And she was so angry at the 4-year-old for wetting the bed that she put him in a hot bath as punishment, and basically burned her baby brother, who then was covered in blisters. And then one of the other adults in the house, another woman, tried to put aloe on it and stuff. The kid needed to go to the ER immediately, but she did what she could, I guess, in her mind, to try to help, and then she was also charged. What's interesting, and the kid ended up passing away. What's interesting, which is it's just the most horrific systemic problem where you have a 15-year-old girl who shouldn't be who has no business taking care of a 4-year-old in the way that she was being asked to, and that doesn't have the skills to know how to do that. Where did she get the idea to put her 4-year-old brother in the hot bath as punishment? Well, she didn't just come up with that.
Right. Agreed. No way you just think of that. You learn it or hear it somewhere.
Or it's done to you.
Yeah. Agreed.
And so you just wonder. And so that was a situation that was really interesting because what an evil 15-year-old. I mean, because I think about me at 15 or you at 15, and I think to myself, I wouldn't let that happen to somebody.
Ever. Right.
Ever. It would never,
Right.
but that's never happened to me.
Right.
I've never been exposed to punishment in that form. And so if that girl was exposed to that, and then her parents left her to handle this 4-year-old, and that's how that kind of stuff happens. That's when you get the idea to do those things. Again, does it make it, it's not justifiable, but it at least explains the depravity. This is like systemic familial depravity where this has been going on and it's been normal. And why aren't the men involved? Well, the men aren't involved because they're not involved in the caretaking of the child.
They're not the caretaker. I completely agree. And often the cases I've seen, I was on the bench and there was a case with a baby who was thrown against a wall and had significant brain injuries for the rest of the baby's life. And he did it because he was left alone with the baby by the mother who had to go to work and didn't have a sitter, said, "Can you just please stay with the baby?" And Rachel, it wasn't even an hour into him being with the baby, and the baby was crying and he was frustrated. So he threw the baby against a wall. I mean, to your point, they're not as frequently the caregiver at all times. And so their frustration can just snap for those who commit crimes, and that can happen. So I have to say this about the example you gave. Also, number one, we know not everyone who is abused abuses, but we also know abusers have learned some of the behaviors somewhere that they then engage in. The second thing I have to say is thank God for forensics, because things like burn marks, you and I both know that if there's an accidental burn, which can happen, right? We hear cases about, for instance, there's a pot of hot water and it's on the stove and the mother turns around and the kid pulls it down. It's not good, but it can be deemed an accident. And you can tell from the way the burns appear on the body and the splash marks that it was an accident. Versus if you put a 4-year-old in a hot tub to discipline, then those marks are going to be very clear as to, yes, this baby was submerged in water. And the same thing with Terrell Peterson. I mean, this doctor who had to pronounce him dead after he came in cardiac arrest, said it was the worst case of child abuse he'd ever seen, head to toe covered in marks and bruises. And that's where I'm thankful forensics tells the story. Terrell Peterson, the reason their conviction, his body told the story of what happened to him for more than a year. That's frightening. But again, the forensics of it make all the difference.
Yeah, they can tell us a lot more about what happened. Yeah, about like what the temperature was in the water, or how he ended up with something blunt force trauma versus falling down the stairs once. And it's also when you see, I think, the layers of injuries, because they can also tell like the timing. This is not a new bruise, or this isn't a new break to a bone. Just the length of time that these things went unaddressed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what comes also with when it comes to what things can happen in the house where a child gets injured. People can make mistakes and hurt a child. I think the reaction that a caretaker has to an injury to a child says a lot about the intention of the injury. So if you're more worried about what's going to happen when you take them to the hospital than you are about getting them the care at the hospital, that says a lot about maybe why you did this. If I accidentally, God forbid, burned my baby with something, I'd be at the Children's Healthcare of Atlanta and
immediately. Yeah, freaking out.
Everyone get the hell out of the way because mommy's got to get to the hospital.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
They would feel that. And so that's, things can happen. And it's I guess it is scary because injury, kids break bones. But just to think that it's normalized within a family
is
that's
crazy.
So hard.
And then
it's so hard to think about. So there's other kids around. You wonder what they've experienced. and just what
And they were made to participate in the abuse. And
Yeah.
if a parent tells you to do something, generally you don't want to be punished, so you're going to do what they say. And if it means abusing another kid, you'd rather do that than be abused yourself. I
And
want to
that's
transition though, because I know this is going to get you going. I know well enough
Yeah.
that. So this case in 2000 was on the front of Time magazine. And here was the headline: "The Shame of Foster Care," with a picture of little tiny 29 pounds at 5 years old Terrell Peterson. And it's because two things happened. Number one, this is a county, a metro county in Atlanta that we all know, Fulton County, Georgia. And not only had DFACS been to the home, seen marks and bruises, removed the child, sent the child back to the abusers, but also there was a big investigation and it was revealed that they had the fraudulent documentation to cover up the fact that they left him in a home of abusers and try to protect them individually by lying in documentation about what they really saw. So let's delve into that piece, because I want your first general reaction to know this child was not only abused to death by his own family, he was completely abused by our own foster care system in terms of they neglected him and then lied about it to cover it up, and he died.
um the lack of value what shocks me is just how little value that child had to society in general. But the foster care system is, doing its best, but is deeply broken. I don't know if you know this. My mom worked with special needs um,
I didn't know that.
foster kids, and actually did special needs foster placements and home studies for a private agency in Cleveland. So I grew up around a lot of foster care related issues and group
It's great
homes.
work.
That's why my mom had no patience for me. I love telling people. She said some kids have nothing. When my sister and I would fight over things. Because there's kids that want homes and they deserve, safe, enriching families and people that love them, and they're in these absolute horrible situations. So what does it mean to me that people who decided to take the job if you work in foster care, you better care about kids.
Right.
You better care about where they are, and use your position to whatever extent you can to protect them. That would be, I
Mhm.
to think that that's not why you go into foster care. I don't know. They don't pay enough for you to do it for any other reason. So you just wonder at what point they become so jaded by just how poorly these kids are treated that they don't think that.
Do anything. They
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
react. They don't do anything.
I feel like as a criminal defense attorney, when I get a case where it looks like someone's innocent, that excites me, right? Because I love fighting for justice. And when that means not being just like a, down the pipeline conviction, it means that I have to actually like assert myself. That's like a dream. So you'd think as like a social worker, like I can help this kid. Like I can be a hero for this child that's being mistreated. I could put my foot down because that's what I'm here for. I'm here to be a barrier to this mistreatment of this child. So yeah, to think that they just didn't care enough.
And so many do. I want to point
I know
out,
they
I
do.
love yeah, I used to represent DFACS, and it was one of my favorite jobs. And generally, all of the people that worked at DFACS that were social workers cared, and
Yeah,
they did everything they could to help families. They were phenomenal people. They're doing God's work.
that's what I'm
And
saying.
so this
For no
yeah,
money. Yeah,
for
so
no money. And what your mom did, and people say, "Oh, you take in foster kids, you make money." No, you don't. You lose money. You don't do it for the money. You do it for the love. You do it for the care of the child. And that's what bothers me so much in this case is it's an anomaly, thank goodness, but it's such a horrific anomaly that it results in a kid's death. And so,
so
it
many
begs the
balls
question.
dropped. So many.
Yeah,
It's like, hey, I'm lobbing you the ball, and they're like, I'm not going to catch it, and the next, no one's catching it. Someone has to catch it, and that's what the whole system's for. To watch the whole system, that many layers of failure is.
right,
Again,
right. It
every
is
child matters.
jaw-dropping.
This child did not deserve that.
Mm-mm.
And just
None
to
of
think,
it.
and people, more than anything, in criminal law, and I guess when you screw up in foster care and family law, um, nobody wants to take accountability. It's like one of the most frustrating things to me. What if defects, instead of stopping what had happened, like, okay, like we realized, like we screwed up. It's never too late to admit that you're wrong and try to be better. But to
Okay.
try to then, like, we're going to pretend that we didn't have our own hands in this and such that nobody has any consequences for what they did wrong. And if there's no consequences, things don't change. So we don't care if it changes. We just don't want to get in trouble.
And I guess the good news is at the end of the day, they got caught, and that does cause change, right? When you have the fraudulent, you have criminal charges against individuals, you have a whole change of the system. And so at the end of the day, the good news is I think it did and can cause a change, a shift in our system to make it better. So there may be a positive in that. So, this was not there's no just, but there was not punishing a child that they said was a bad kid and accidentally taking it too far. This was torture designed to inflict maximum suffering and control, putting him in a dog collar, feeding him out of a dog bowl, making him eat out of a toilet, eat human feces. The irrational rage directed at this little tiny 29-pound 5-year-old child. And it wasn't one kind of torture. It was physical, it was starvation, it was mental, it was emotional, it was writing instructions to say, this is what we're going to do. It was torture, it was burns on the feet. Just the rage. It's unimaginable. Thankfully, the 2 people who committed these atrocities, yes, they're in prison for the rest of their lives. But let me get your final thoughts, if I could, please.
My final thoughts are that it's really important that we all, if we see something, we have to say something. There's more than those 2 women that were around this child and knew that something wasn't right. And, I'm glad that justice was ultimately served in this case and that the people that committed these atrocious crimes are never getting out. But I also wish that we could have prevented, that we could try to prevent the torture, and death of senseless death of children. And so I think that really requires that in our own families, if we see something, or friends, if we see something that doesn't seem right, that like we need to probably do something about it to whatever extent we can. Call the authorities, call the right people. And I guess in this case, defects had been involved. So, sometimes you can do your best and it still goes wrong, but it never hurts to try to do your best and help as many people as you can. That's my
And improve the system. Yeah. And fight another day to improve our system. Rachel Kaufman, thank you so much.
Thanks for
Don't
having
hang
me.
up. I love seeing you. You look great. I'm so
Thank you.
proud of you. I'm so happy for you.